Good morning, everyone. Bom dia a todos. Good morning to the West Coast of the United States and Canada. Good morning, still a very early morning to those friends of ours that have been loyally with us for the last 3 days from Hawaii. Some people getting up like at 6 in the morning. Bless you for that. And good afternoon to those folks in the East Coast of the United States and Canada. Good afternoon to those in Portugal, and good afternoon to all those wherever you may be throughout the entire Portuguese-speaking world. Good afternoon or good evening. On behalf of the Luso-American Education Foundation, the 48th Conference on Education and Culture, welcome. On behalf of PBBI from Fresno State hosting the same, welcome as well. This is, of course, our conference, Roots and Routes, or Roots and Roots, if you say route or roo. It depends how you pronounce it. Roots and Routes, constructing identities in the California Portuguese community and building, of course, and its role with the Lusophone world. We are going to have our first presenter here in just a few minutes, but before that, I would like to welcome, of course, the president. Actually, we have both. The presenter is also an officer at Luso America, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. The president of the Luso American Education Foundation is the president of the board is our good friend Maria Holise. And Maria, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're all busy doing 5 million things, and you're busy doing 5 million and one, because I think you belong to about 182 organizations as of last count. And that's just the Portuguese and the Macaense, not counting everything else. So welcome. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours.
Bon dia, and thank you and congratulations, Denise, for hosting this conference and spearheading it for the Luso American Education Foundation. We've had a few days of very interesting topics and great speakers, and I hope everybody's enjoying it. And again, this afternoon at 12 p.m., we will hear more about our organization of all our different committees and what they do. But basically, the foundation was organized in 1963. And we offer a lot of scholarships and grants to different high school seniors and college students of Portuguese descent, or those that are taking Portuguese classes. And with these scholarships, we do a lot of fundraising. And one of our main fundraisers is really our golf tournament, which we just had and was a very successful event. And we also have a cultural youth summer camp where we teach a lot of cultural and heritage stuff to all the students ages 17 and under, and they really have a great learning experience. And we also have a Dia de Portugal celebration where we celebrate our heritage. And of course, our annual conference, which is about roots and routes these few days. So again, thank you for everybody, and I hope you enjoy this conference.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much for taking time. We appreciate it. And again, we'll be in touch, of course, at the end of the conference with a report. And thanks to Luis for co-hosting it with myself and being a lot of help the last few days as well. Sometimes remembering questions that I forget. It's a problem as you get older. But we won't talk about age. We'll talk about our presenter, which is also the chairman of the board of the Luso American Education Foundation. Dr. Deolinda Adão is, I was going to say, widely known in the Portuguese American community in California. But when I said that last time about somebody, our dear and departed friend who we miss, Anthony Barcelos, I introduced another writer as widely known, and then I introduced Anthony, and he said, I guess I'm just narrowly known. So I better be very careful when we put these adjectives, you know. But Deolinda is very well known in the Portuguese American community. Her work with Luso, her work with other organizations as well in the Bay Area, particularly the East Bay, and her work, of course, for, I don't know, Deolinda, what, 25 years or 30 with the Portuguese Studies Center at UC Berkeley? At least 25, I'm sure. Probably more like 30. No? You're on, I can't hear you. You're on mute. Sorry.
About 20.
About 20. Okay. So 20 years. Well, but the center wasn't the same before you, and I might add, without any negativism, it's not the same without you. So welcome to obviously the Luso conference of the foundation that you chair. We're happy to have you. Deolinda has done lots of research, especially when it comes to women writers, that are female, or identify with a female genre. And we don't know exactly how to say that sometimes, but anyway, she has done both extensive research in women during the dictatorship in Portugal and beyond, and she has done extensive research when it comes to the Portuguese American and Portuguese Canadian and diaspora women in general as well. Just last week, one of the books that she coordinated, and I don't have it here next to me, but I'll get it later, was our book of the week for our project Olhos nos Livros, Eyes on Books. It was the book that was part of a conference on women in the diaspora that I think was published probably about 14, 15 years ago, at least, by UC Berkeley. So, Deolinda, welcome. I know that you're on vacation. Thanks for cutting into your vacation and presenting this wonderful topic with us. So, welcome.
Thank you so much for the great introduction, Denise. And I would also like to take the opportunity to thank you and your co-host for all the work you've done for this conference and the last 5. Is that right? Isn't this the 5th?
Yes, the 5th one that we've done online.
Correct. You've made the change to online seem easy. I know that's not the case. So I would like to thank you very much and publicly acknowledge all the work you have done to make sure we continue to have an education conference. So I would like to start with that. I would also like to start by apologizing. I would like to present today a work on Portuguese American women writers. Unfortunately, I don't have those on my iPad, and I am on vacation, didn't bring my computer. So I had to do the best I could. But at least one of these women it was diasporic because she was not born in Portugal. She was born in the Azores. So I guess it covers it a little bit. So I think we can go to the first slide, whoever's controlling that. Okay. So I'll just leave it at that until we kind of get to it as a sort of a background to what to my introduction. So one of the interests driving my investigation is the search for a possible link between artistic production and socially accepted aesthetics, and particularly the gendering of both. Thus, one must start by questioning the parameters that guide both the construction of socially and culturally accepted aesthetics and the artistic production that either adopts or rejects those aesthetics. Without entering into discussion of aesthetics, which has kept philosophers fully engaged since Socrates, there are a few notions that we aim to address at this time. One is the notion introduced by Plato that art production is threatening to society, so much so that he much rather not have poets and playwrights in his republic. Faced with the impossibility, he advocated heavy censoring of the artistic production of not only poets and playwrights, but also of musicians and painters. In sum, according to Plato, the arts have the power to influence humans and mold character. As such, art producers must be strictly controlled. Of course, this concept seems to be at the base and provide justification for censorship as a whole and in any form. But it must also be looked at as the driving force in canon construction. The intrinsic connection developed by the founders of Western thought, linking beauty and goodness, and in opposition, ugliness and evil, has been fundamental to the construction of Western aesthetics and hence art production. Since, as Socrates defended, beauty is relative, we must logically infer that as such, each society is able to construct its own notion of goodness through the construction of a socially endorsed notion of beauty. This process is amply found throughout the history of the Western world and goes well beyond the realm of art production. In any event, for our purposes, we will only concern ourselves with literary production, and more specifically on how these arbitrarily constructed aesthetic parameters impact feminine literary production. Furthermore, we will concentrate our analysis on Portuguese women writers of the last 100 years. Of the hundreds of women who wrote and published in Portugal since 1910, many of whom remain unknown to this day, we will focus on only a few, namely Ana de Castro Osório, Florbela Espanca, Maria Lamas, Judith Teixeira, and Natália Correia. All these women published during their respective lives and posthumously, and to varying degrees, their work is known in Portuguese academic and literary circles. However, several questions remain. Are any of these women considered canonic Portuguese writers? Does their writing correspond to the accepted aesthetic parameters of their time? How are they represented on, or are they even included in histories of Portuguese literature? How is present-day academia reading these authors and their texts? Here, we aim to address some of these questions and attempt to include the writing of Portuguese female authors in the wider discussion of aesthetic values and canon construction in all areas of art. To some extent, we will also address that which is perhaps the most significant question when discussing the artistic production of women. Are these simply writers who happen to be women, or is there something that sets these writers apart in such a way that they should be grouped in a subdivision of literary producers identified as women writers? Zé Luís, can you check if my next slide is about Ana de Castro Osório? Hello, Zé Luís?
Yeah, I don't have that possibility. Denise will be the one to do that. So I don't have control.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay. So I guess I'm calling out to Denise.
Yes.
Hello. So
Yeah,
as long as we have the Portuguese, as
here.
long as we have the Portuguese modernism slide up,
Okay.
I wanted to put it up because to a degree, at least 4 of these women, oh, there she is. But anyway, to a degree, at least 3 of the first 3 women we'll discuss have something to do with the modernism, because they're either just before it or during it, although none of them were identified with being part of it. So Ana de Castro Osório was born in 1882, and she was one of the most prominent women in the Portuguese Republican movement. She was an activist and avid defender of women's rights in Portugal. In 1909, she was one of the founders of the Liga Republicana de Mulheres Portuguesas, or the Republican League of Portuguese Women, which provided a venue for open discussion of important social issues such as divorce and women raising children alone. Between 1898 and 1931, she published at least 24 books, several of which on the subject of motherhood. In 1908, A Boa Mãe, which means the good mother. 1925, A Verdadeira Mãe, the true mother. And in 1930, O Direito da Mãe, the rights of mothers. She's also considered to be the first Portuguese writer of literature for children. Although she was a prolific writer, she's better known for her pro-Republican and pro-women's rights activism and for her literary accomplishments. In the History of Portuguese Literature by A.J. Saraiva and Oscar Lopes, she's only briefly mentioned, and I quote, first writer of children's literature, writer of fiction and drama, actively connected with the struggle of feminine emancipation, end of quote. Likewise, the History of Portuguese Literature, published by Alpha Editors, mentions Ana de Castro Osório 3 times in connection to her friendship with Camilo Peçanha, and one in reference to the neo-romantic reconstruction of realism and naturalism in her novels, Ambições of 1903, and Quatro Novelas of 1908. The first meaning being ambitions, and the second four novels. Other than that, references to her work are limited to texts such as this United Dictionary of Portuguese Women Writers, where the title and date of publication of each of her works is listed, but no further reference or additional information is given in regard to any of them. From her social and political activity, we can gather that most likely her texts did not in any way conform to the aesthetic values of that time, at least in theme, if not in form. The latter seems to be substantiated by the above-mentioned source, where she is identified as a neo-romantic, while many of her male contemporaries are singing the praises of realism and naturalism. We will now change to Florbela Espanca, Diniz, please. There she is. Florbela Espanca, born in Vila Viçosa on the 8th of December of 1894, is widely known. Her sonetos have had uncountable editions, and she's regularly included in anthologies of Portuguese poetry. She's also well known outside of literary circles, and several of her sonnets have been set to music and are included in the repertoire of many well-known Portuguese singers, particularly fado singers. Nonetheless, she remains a controversial figure in Portuguese academia, who consistently label her as a lesser poet and mostly ignore her prose. Usually, the argument presented is that her poetry should be included in the Parnassian movement. I bet she's writing during the period of the Portuguese modernism. If we were to agree with this argument, then it must be noted that she, as had been the case with Osório, is writing outside of the accepted aesthetic norms. However, her illegitimacy goes well beyond the aesthetic nonconformity. Actually, her entire life is nothing but a long list of illegitimacies. In her birth certificate, she is listed as being the child of an unknown father, although she's raised by him and his second wife, who was also her grandmother. But he never recognizes his paternity until 1949, which is 19 years after Florbela's death. She married 3 times, in 1913, 1922, and 1925, and divorced twice, 1921 and 1922. And in 1930, on her 36th birthday, she died of a barbiturates overdose, although her death certificate lists the cause of death as pulmonary edema. Thus, according to the norms of Portuguese society, Florbela leaves life as illegitimately as she had entered it. The fundamental themes of Florbela's writing, death, love, and the multiplicity of the self, can be somewhat responsible for the literary critics' distaste for her work. As such, the qualifications as a Parnassian is justified by the constant presence of death and love in her poetry and prose. On the other hand, the notion of multiplicity of self developed in her work, which would put her in dialogue with the Portuguese modernists, her contemporaries, is either ignored or dismissed as a symptom of her neurosis. Nonetheless, the argument can and has been made by several literary critics that in Florbela, these 3 themes are intrinsically connected and addressed in a form that distance her from the Parnassians, although she shares their taste for the sonnet. As stated by Maria Lúcia de Alfarra in her text Afinado Desconcerto, for Florbela, both death and absolute love are the sublime, and that which links the poet to the divine. Furthermore, de Alfarra states that for Florbela's life is but an interlude between 2 spaces of transcendence, that which precedes birth and follows death. As such, it is clearly evidenced in the poem Loucura, or Insanity. The multiplicity of self, or lack of self-recognition, is but one of the torments endured by the poet during her captivity within the realm of the living. Diniz, do I have a slide with the poem, with those? Yeah. Okay, I think it may be, aha, that's it. That is the poem. So as you can see, oh, fearful ill of being alone, oh, fearful and cruel ill of having so many souls laughing within my own. Thus, to say that Florella diverged from the aesthetic norms of her time would be somewhat of an understatement, and perhaps much of the discomfort still evidenced by Portuguese academics in regard to her and her work lies precisely on that nonconformity. Nor she nor her poetry is simple and clear, for both are at once traditional and radical, submissive and uncontrollable, untamable and blasphemous. For Florella is not the priestess of love, she is, woman, the representation of the divine, the embodiment of love itself, which becomes consecrated through death. It is through death that the rite of passage from the human into the divine is completed, and all the souls trapped within the poet's own are finally freed. Florella's exuberant and painful, bewitching poetry established the link between the female body and the divine, and this process increasingly strays from the socially and politically constructed notions of femininity. This shift is most likely the cause of the removal of her texts from the literary circles of her time, and I would argue it is still the basis for Portuguese academics' dismissal of her work. I think next we have Judith Teixeira. There we go. Judith Teixeira was perhaps one of the most controversial Portuguese women writers of the 20th century. She was born in 1880 and is considered to have been one of the few women, if not the only woman, that participated in the Portuguese modernist movement. And when I say only woman, I mean from the literary perspective. She married and divorced under the accusation of adultery and home abandonment. She later remarried, and little more is known about her private life. She published in several literary magazines, including the Contemporânea, and she also published 5 books, Decadência de mim, Nua, Satânica, and Poemas. So the titles are Decadence of Me, Naked, Satan, and Poetry, which, by the way, is 4 more than the emblematic Fernando Pessoa ever published in life. However, both she and her poetry were scandalous, mostly due to the open homoerotic nature of many of her poems, as is the case of the poem Statue. And we see an excerpt from that poem being projected on the slide. As well as to the frequent reference to drug use, namely morphine-induced orgies. Her poetry would continue to cause some surprise to this day, and it's most definitely not within the aesthetic norms of our time. Perhaps, consequently, she continues to be consistently ignored to date. She's hardly ever represented in anthologies of Portuguese poetry. This includes the anthology of erotic Portuguese poetry compiled by Natália Correia, which has no mention of her. Likewise, she's barely mentioned in the Dicionário of Portuguese Literature organized by Álvaro Manuel Machado, and not at all in the History of Portuguese Literature authored by Saraiva and Oscar Lopes. She's mentioned in the Dicionário de Escritores Portugueses, according to which she is also included in the Dicionário Cronológico de Autores Portugueses by António Lisboa, and in the Dicionário de Literatura by Jacinto Prado Coelho. This same source further states that her book, Decadência, is also mentioned in Cecília Barreira's book, Histórias das Nossas Avós, Retratos da Burguesia em Lisboa. However, the authors of the mentioned text confer in the less than 2/3 of a page dedicated to Judith Teixeira that, and I quote, even now her poems cannot be found in most anthologies, end of quote. The argument can be made that Judith was the argument can be made that Judith was not the best poet of her time. That argument is weakened by the observation that her poetry was at least at par with that of several of her male counterparts, who are widely known and consistently included in literary dictionaries as well as most anthologies. Likewise, she was not the only poet that exposed their drug dependence in their poems. However, she was the first Portuguese woman to write lesbian homoerotic poetry. And it seems that it is precisely that particularity that caused her book Decadencia to be confiscated in 1923 by order of the governor of Lisbon, who further ordered that all copies be burned in the public square and prohibited its republication. In the same year of 1923, Judith published a conference with the title Demin, in which she defends her poetry and lays out her position regarding life as a whole, as well as aesthetics and morality. It seems unquestionable that Judith Teixeira was writing well outside the aesthetic parameters of her time, and perhaps even of our time. The price she paid was erasure, and the handful of literature students and scholars who study poetry are mostly those that are focusing on either gender studies or non-canonic 20th century literature. I think the next one is Maria Lamas. There we go. Born in 1893, Maria Lamas has the particularity of having lived all three moments of the Portuguese Republic. She was born under monarchic rule and died in 1983, almost a decade after the 1974, in 1983, almost a decade after the 74 revolution that put an end to the state-run censorship. Besides writing novels and essays, she worked as a translator and as a journalist. For 20 years, she was the chief editor of the popular women's magazine Modas e Bordados, Fashion and Embroidery, and also the Portuguese version of Dear Abby, publishing an advice column under the pseudonym of Tia Filomena, Aunt Filomena. She was also politically engaged and an activist for women's rights. In 1945, she was elected president of the National Council of Portuguese Women, an association that had been founded during the First Republic, but was outlawed by the new state in 1947. The closing down of the National Council of Portuguese Women is directly linked to an exhibit organized by Maria Lamas in the Sociedade Nacional de Belas Artes in Lisbon. This exhibit, with the title Exposição de Livros Escritos por Mulheres, and that it's an exhibit of books written by women, was held between the 4th and the 12th of January of 1947 and gathered close to 3,000 books written by 1,500 authors from 28 countries. Besides being a great success in establishing a worldwide dialogue between women writers, the catalog that accompanied the exhibit provides precious information regarding the number of women writing and publishing in many different countries. Lamas' speech closed the exhibit and opened the Estado Novo's prosecution of the Women's Council. On the 4th of June of that same year, less than 6 months after the exhibit, the Women's Council was closed, and a few weeks after that, on the 25th of June, Lamas was fired from Modas e Bordados, never again to find steady work in Portugal. After surviving on several temporary and odd jobs and being arrested several times, in 1961, she sought exile in Paris when she remained until 70. In the preface of the 2002 publication of Lamas' novel Para Além do Amor, Eugênia Vaz states that, and I quote, "The case of Maria Lamas as a novelist is an example of the type of cultural crime perpetrated by dictatorships that is not talked about because it goes unseen, but that is a lethal and devastating as the cold walls of solitary confinement. I refer to the crime of asphyxiation and gagging of the artist, and in the particular case of Maria Lamas, the total annihilation of the budding novelist. Thus, in the case of Maria Lamas, it is clear that as long as she restricted her activities to the socially and politically accepted constraint, as in the case of the women's magazine she directed, state control was contained within the common levels of state-run censorship. However, when the writer began to expand her area of intervention and takes a position regarding any social or political issue, she's immediately constrained and punished. In the case of Maria Lamas, as in all the writers we have considered up to this point, that punishment was the removal of any type of interlocutor with whom these women could be dialoguing, or in other words, the erosion or dismissal of their voices and of their subsequent attainment of agency. And we need to go one more slide, please. Oh, that's the novel. That is a copy of the novel, of the preprint of the novel, and now we are with the powerhouse herself. Or should I say the volcano? The last writer that I would like to briefly address is Natalia Correia, who was born on September 13, 1923 in Feijão de Baixo, near the city of Ponta Delgada, island of São Miguel, Açores. Correia was a very prolific writer who between 1946 and 1993 published poetry, novels, essays, drama, and even a cantata. She was also politically engaged. In 1944, she participated in the Democratic Unity Movement. In 1958, she supported the candidacy of Humberto Delgado. In 1969, she enlisted in the Electoral Committee of the Democratic Unity. And in 1979 and 1987, she was elected as a member of the Portuguese Assembly. In both her literary and her political life, Natalia directly addressed the construction and definition of the feminine in parallel to that of the masculine, rather than in contrast or opposition, thus bypassing the then in vogue male-female binary. In Natalia, the construction of the feminine is based on the female body and female sexuality, writing from within a sexist and moralist society that legislated and controlled the female body, and under the scrutiny of the Estado Novo censorship that oversaw all artistic production, Natalia dared to construct a mythology of the feminine that rejects previously established markers of feminine identity. In other words, the women arising from Natalia's work is neither the virgin nor the sinner. She is the merger of the two, a woman of flesh and blood that defines herself by taking ownership of her own body and of her sexuality, and as is evidenced in the following poem. I think the poem is next. Dinesh. Can you? Okay, there we go. And so the poem in question is There Are Days and Days. And I'll let you read on that as I continue. As it was to be expected, several of Natalia's texts, such as O Encoberto, are seized by the censorship, and in 1970 she tried for the publication of the Antologia de Poesia Portuguesa Erótica e Satírica, receiving a sentence of 3 years in jail, although her sentence was later suspended. As it has been the case in all the writers we mentioned, at least until April 25, 1974, both Natalia herself and her work were clearly controlled and silenced by the governmental and social power structures of the Portuguese society of her time. It also seems rather clear that all of these women were writing outside of the socially accepted aesthetics aesthetic norms of their time, and that to some extent that contributed to the poor acceptance of their work at the time of publication, as well as of the lack of canonic recognition of their work. In the anthology, A Urgência de Contar, Contos de Mulheres dos Anos 40, Ana Paula Ferreira looks at the literary production of women female writers during the 40s, and in the preface entitled A Literatura Feminina nos anos 40, Feminine Literature in the 40s, a history of exclusion, states that, and I quote, taking into account that perspectives centered on women's writers or gender-related politics have been practically ignored by Portuguese literature studies, it then should not be surprising that the literary production of women not identified with the hegemony of some isms has been ignored. End of quote. We would argue that this phenomenon is not exclusive to the literary production of Portuguese women of the 40s, but of the greater part of the 20th century, if not the entire history of Portuguese literary production. In the post-1974 Portugal, many things have changed, and some would argue that women were the greatest victors of the 25th of April Revolution. Presently, there is an abundance of women writers in Portugal, several of whom enjoy both critical appraisal and financial success. However, as we've entered the second decade of the 21st century, in one of the exhibit rooms of the Cadeia de Relação in the city of Porto, visitors can find the plaque, which lists several famous or infamous individuals that at one time or another were incarcerated in that institution. This informative plaque includes the Portuguese writer Camilo Castelo Branco and his lover and subsequent wife, Ana Plácido, who is simply described as escritora sem talento, or writer without talent, which leads us to conclude that the dismissal and erasure of Portuguese feminine voices in print is still alive and well in today's fully democratic Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you, Deolinda. Excellent as always. And one quick question, if I may, if you allow.
May.
Okay, good.
Quick, long, whatever.
Quick. Yeah, I'll try to be quick. From your knowledge and from your studying of women writers in Portugal, are any of these writers, there's been a little bit of an opening everywhere in academia, as you not as much, okay? But are any of these women studied a bit more now? Maybe
No.
they were 5 or 6 years ago?
No.
Okay.
There are no thesis, no doctoral thesis on any of the women that I've spoke about. Not even a master. I believe there are a couple of masters. There are some masters on Natalia Correia, but there is no doctoral thesis that I know of to this point. Natalia Correia is yet to be translated, as you well know. I tried very much to raise the funds to be able to do an edition of a bilingual edition of her works. Nobody was interested. It was like, oh, no. And she is one of Azor's greatest writers. And not in the mainland, not in the Azores. Nobody wanted to hear about it. Nobody was interested.
Angela Almeida has done
yes.
the only doctorate on her, but there is a young man now that's beginning, which is good news.
Yes.
Pedro Cordeiro Ponte is doing actually with oh my gosh, professor that you know well, Severino Teixeira, right? Am I saying that?
Yes, Severiano Teixeira.
Teixeira, exactly. So
yes.
he is doing a
but I believe they're working more on the political. Aspect.
Yeah,
because Teixeira is from politics.
Right.
Political studies.
It's not on the literary aspects.
It's not a literary, and she was absolutely brilliant. Not as a female writer, she was a brilliant writer. Maybe that's the problem. Too brilliant. You know.
Do you think that? I mean, this sounds little, and I'm going to preface it by saying it sounds little, and it sounds almost anecdotal. But do you think it might be because, as you know, we've discussed this when you had a session on Italian quite a few years ago that you brought a couple of people from Portugal, and we discussed this. I recall at UC Berkeley, which was. She wasn't the friendliest toward the academics. She had some words.
Justifiably so.
But so do you think that there still is some kind of I don't know, anti-corpus against her or something like that, or you know?
Well, it was not only was she brilliant, but she was also a very strong woman. She was a strikingly beautiful woman. And extremely powerful. And she created a lot of discomfort by many of her male counterparts. And at that point, academia was almost exclusively controlled by males. So, and still in Portugal, there is this problem in Portuguese academia. So when you have an advisor, you want to study something, and you have an advisor, you want to study something that your advisor is likes or is good at, because if your advisor is pleased with you, he may help you get a job. Because there are very few positions in universities, and everybody wants them, and yada yada yada. So, and unlike in the United States, where we're encouraged to go someplace else, they just kind of stay. And if people don't do theses that are going to prove that their advisors are correct in their own thesis, then they don't get very far. So we have, unfortunately, a repetition of themes. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of Camões things that, how many thousands of PhDs on, well, not even, he's not too much, but Essa Queiroz. There are more PhD theses on Essa Queiroz, 60% of which all say the same thing. You know, so it is still difficult to find someone who's willing to say, hey, you know, I haven't written about this, but let's do it. And so most PhDs are about male authors in Portugal still, and I'm saying like 80%. The only women the women of the 20th century that are well covered by Portuguese academia is Cristina Bessa Luís, and Lydia Jorge is coming to it is being more and more accepted. Winning the Reina Sofia, you know, kind of helped a lot, but nonetheless, so it's very difficult to find. You know, I really, in Natalia's case, I really have hoped that at least the Azores would claim ownership to this amazing. She was an amazing woman. You know, I remember her as a little girl. I didn't know who she was. I now know that that she was the one, but my uncle, who I used to tag me along when he wanted to go out and say that he was going to passear a menina, which was not what he was doing. He was meeting up with his friends and just giving me a couple of cents to go buy some old books and keep myself entertained. He was in the same circles. So as I see pictures of her, it came as I was growing up and studying this, my childhood memories came. And people stopped talking when she entered the room. She was a force of nature, as people say. And I think it's sometimes threatening now, much less that long ago. I mean, you know what she did in Parliament. You know, when that. I mean, I don't want to talk about that. But
poem that even the right had to laugh at.
I mean, it was like.
I would have loved to have been there. But
yes. But then we would be very old and decrepit.
That's true.
Older and more decrepit.
And the sad situation with Natalia, and of course, as you know, we've started a Cátedra Natalia Correia at Fresno State without any help from anybody, because nobody wants to go do it. So we're just putting our own funds in it.
Well, one of these days we need to talk, and we need to do something about Natalia.
We do.
Just a little something.
I believe that it is sad that 30 years after her death, and it hasn't been, 4 or 5 years, 30 years after her death, the University of the Azores hasn't done much about it. And as it was pointed out in an interview a couple of days ago by this young man, Pedro Cordeiro Ponte, for the Correio dos Açores, there are literally dozens, if not hundreds, of boxes, because Natalia dedicated her whole spolio. Hundreds of boxes donated to the government of the Azores. She donated everything to the government of the Azores. But
I believe they're still sitting in the National Library.
Oh, they're now at the public one in Ponta Delgada, but they're sitting there now instead. So.
Well, and nobody has access to them. I've tried. and I was able to get them to give me copies. So I said, I had to say, I want copies of box 47 and 120 or something. And then they photocopied that. I paid quite a bit for them, but I do have the digital copies so that I can actually do something should there be anybody interested in doing something with her stuff. But because the boxes were all in the, down in the basement, unopened, because the library, the excuse that and I asked, also our friend, also an Azorian, oh my goodness, Carlos Reis, what was that? And he goes, we just didn't have the resources. There is so much stuff, and we knew we weren't going to keep it. It was going to go to the Azores. We could not set that much money to go through the boxes and open this up to the public, and then not be ours.
Yeah, and it's sad, as you know, and you know this probably better than Joe-Luis and I as well, which is you can't find a book of hers in any bookstore because all of the editions, of course, were sold out, and nobody's doing any new re-editions, which is
no, because the problem, it has to do with the rights, the copyrights, because I actually have the rights. I have the rights to publish something from her. I have that right. I received that I have a letter that gives me the right to that. I was able to get that. I just wasn't able to get any support. And by myself, this is such a gigantic work that you can't do this on the side while you're doing everything else. You'd have to find people to help you and sift through all this stuff. But it is pretty difficult to get you. I had to get it from 3 different sources, because she left different things to different people, to different institutions, and so I was able to get him from all 3. So if I wanted to publish something with Natalia's texts, I could.
That's great. And we need to talk.
We'll talk.
We'll talk. Wonderful, because and even in Portuguese, I mean, it's sad that even in Portuguese we can't get her work. I think her theater pieces were all just done in a collection by a young Portuguese theater director.
Correct.
Not too long ago, but it's just you can't find her novels. You can't find a lot of
poetry.
And Descobrir Europeia, is Kanakamat,
or Matria is.
Yeah, or Matria, all of them.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you so much, Deolinda.
Thank you.
Before we go to the next part, which is Deolinda's official capacity as CEO of the
not CEO. There's
Chairman of the board. COB. Okay, COB.
Yeah.
No, I just want to say I enjoyed fully, and I have to say I've been a fan of Flor Espanca since I was a young teenager. She's one of my favorite poets in Portuguese literature, so she was not forgotten, at least by me.
She was not. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no academic work done on her work, which again is a sin. It's sinful.
Yes.
You're right. Me too. All young ladies, we were given a book of her sonnets by an older woman in our lives.
And the short stories are quite good too.
To me, they're better they're even better. The short stories are unbelievable. Yeah. A Margem de Soneto is brilliant. I don't know if you've read that one.
Yes.
It's just brilliant.
Yes.
Yeah.
And her work is easier to find now in Portuguese, right, Deolinda, or no?
The sonnets, yes, but not the short stories. They're hard.
Yeah. There's a Contos Complex. That's good. They did anthology of short stories.
But I do want to add that everything I said about these women applies to Portuguese women writing in the United States. It was not really until Confernce that anybody broke through. And there have been women writing. If you go through the old newspapers from the beginning of the century, if you go through the old Portuguese newspapers, you will see that there were women writing and contributing. But then when it comes to any book form or to anybody talking about them, they all went by the wayside. And so everything I said also applies to all the Portuguese women who were writing in California and other areas of Portuguese communities.
Fortunately.
If I could link it to that.
Again, thank you so much, Deolinda.
Thank you.
And appreciate it. Very, very insightful as always. A couple words as chairman of the board of Luso before we go to our next conference. I know that you can be with us at 12. So
yes. So
whatever.
I basically said it before I started, but I would like to do a couple of things. First, once again, thank the two of you, Denise and Zé Luís, for putting this together. You being the grandmaster of it all, and Zé Luís being your loyal Sancho, who's always there supporting you. Although you don't have a panza. I mean, please don't take offense to that.
I actually am the one with a panza, okay?
Well, but it's okay, yeah. You don't have whiskers either, but that's okay. And what I would like to do is invite as many of those who are watching to join and maybe become members of the Education Foundation. It is very important that we continue to be a presence in California. The Education Foundation is a part of the Luso structure and family, but we're not there to serve exclusively Luso members. We are there to serve the Portuguese community, Portuguese Americans, and also the community of students who want to learn Portuguese in either high school or continue or in college. So we are hoping to remain a presence, and our membership is really cheap. I don't know all the prices, but they're super cheap. It's a very worthy cause because as both Denise and Zé Luís and many of the people can vouch, their children were recipients. Your children do not need to be a member to benefit, but it is good to be a member. Then you also know about all of the events and keep up with all the notifications. And basically, I would like to thank all the members on the board for the great work they've been doing for this last year, for the Education Foundation and helping me come out smelling like a rose when I really have had a hard year this year. Had a couple of accidents that have made my life slightly miserable, but that's okay. They've done a lot of work and made it look like everything was fine, and I appreciate that very, very much. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Deolinda. And I would like to say that also that on behalf of PBBI, for full transparency, we want to thank Luso America Education Foundation for the grants, the multi-year grants that they gave us this year, and on task to give us next year, hopefully. But I full transparency. I want to say that that PBBI acknowledges that, and actually acknowledged in all of our literature as well. But that we put out. However, we want to thank Deolinda, Zé Luís, and everyone on the board that agreed to this partnership. We are appreciative. Luso has done the Education Foundation, the whole Luso family, the Education Foundation in particular, as Deolinda said, has funded scholarships, grants, students going to Portugal. I mean, way back to the 60s. So, we have people who went to Portugal in the 60s and actually even current and past Portuguese language teachers. My colleague for many years at Tulare School District, Niels Betancourt, went to Portugal when she went back to school to do her bachelor's to become a teacher, to two summer courses in Coimbra to learn a bit more Portuguese so she could teach it.
But you always know thanks, because partnering with programs such as the one at Fresno State is part of our reason to exist. That is why the Education Foundation is there. So as long as we can identify programs that are well run and that are doing their job of promoting Portuguese language and Portuguese culture, it is our obligation to assist you in that endeavor.
Thank you, Deolinda. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Beijinhos,
We'll talk about Natalia. Don't forget about that. Thank
I
you.
will not. We'll talk.
Okay.
I'm
Thank you.
back on the 11th.
Hey.
Bye.
Thank you. That was Deolinda Adão, Professor Deolinda Adão from University of California, Berkeley, director of the Portuguese Studies program there for many years. I'm going to just, we're not going to log off, but I'm going to stop the recording, just to let you know, because when we post these to our archive, we want to have these in different segments so folks can watch them separately.